For a very long time, we thought that dreams were messages from otherworldly realms. You've heard about the biblical story of Joseph? That's what REM dreams are about. 11 stars, the moon and the sun, prostrating to him. Walking about in this bizarre landscape and you're seeing the star and the moon, what's actually going on inside your brain. If I was to look at a guy who's awake and I look at a guy who's in REM, their brains look the same. For a long time, we have had no answer, but now we are getting closer to understand that certain structures in the brain actually shut down and other structures become hyperactive. So there goes the theory that when you sleep, your neurons are just becoming calm, and no, the brain suddenly speeds up, everything becomes hyperactive, all the neurons are firing in this erratic pattern. There's actually a whole neurochemistry and neurophysiology to dreams. PTSD nightmares occur in deep sleep. And how tragic. Your brain refuses to go into the REM state because you have so much noradrenaline circulating in your system. Sleepwalking, sleep talking, teeth grinding, sleep paralysis. How dreams can heal you in dreams because you don't have stress. You can tackle threatening situations in a calm, completely cool manner. If you want to know these things, then this course is for you. All right, so we'll be talking about sleep in this lecture. Of course, this is a course about dreams, but we have to start somewhere, and sleep is a good place to start. Right, Arnold?
Right.
In this course, I'll go from things like why do we sleep, how do we fall asleep, why is sleep important? Then we'll go into dreams and the nature of dreams, why dreams are important, how dreams arise in the brain. Then we go farther out to the edges of dreams to talk about things like sleepwalking, why people sometimes will sleepwalk, right? And then we'll talk about nightmares. We'll talk about sleep paralysis. Have you heard about sleep paralysis before? This condition where you lie in your bed, paralyzed, unable to move or speak, and suddenly you feel like there's a demon coming from the corner of the room, approaching you, pressing your chest, strangling you, right? You see all these monsters. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about dreams and creativity, how dreams are this magical landscape where the neurophysiology of your brain is completely different from the neurophysiology we know from wakefulness, and how this lends itself to creativity. How creative people throughout history have used dreams to sort of harness their creativity and get new ideas and do scientific experiments all through their dreams. So we'll look at that. Then we'll talk about dream monsters, like why people have these monsters in their dreams, heavenly, these monsters that attacks them, and you try to run and you're paralyzed, you can't move your feet, they're so heavy. You had that dream before? You want to just move, but they're so damn heavy, right? So we'll talk about that, why these dreams come about, why people all around the world have these dreams. And then finally, we end off on the topic of why and how dreams can be very healing and very nurturing. How it is that dreaming heals our emotions and makes us more calm and can be therapeutic. And if you have PTSD and trauma and anxiety and depression, dreaming can erase all the negative emotions within you. So we'll go into that. Does that sound good? All right. But let's start somewhere. So sleep. Sleep is an interesting topic. I've been traveling lately, having jet lag, so my sleep is all over the place. But I'm not sleep deprived in the big sense. There was this guy, Michael Cork. He had issues with sleep for a few days. He couldn't sleep. He was trying to sleep, but he couldn't. And he kept trying, but he felt aroused. He felt like his mind was all over the place, wandering. He just couldn't sleep. And then he tried to sleep on the couch for a few days. You know, he thought his wife snoring was the culprit, the issue. But it really wasn't, because he couldn't sleep after 4 or 5 days on the couch. But he kept trying and trying and trying to sleep on the couch, but nothing happened. He just couldn't fall asleep. About day 10, he decided to go to his doctor, and he said, doctor, I can't sleep, for God's sake. What's going on? And so the doctor said, well, this is very strange. Let's have a look at you. But they couldn't really find a cause. It was so weird. The guy couldn't sleep. I mean, that's the most basic and fundamental thing of all, yet he couldn't sleep. At this point, things kept going. He just couldn't sleep. Day 20, he was using a cane to walk. He was that fatigued and that tired. Imagine, have you tried to not sleep for a few days, Arnold? Have you tried that before? Imagine for 20 days no sleep. That's pretty severe. At this point, his predicament continued. It went all the way to 6 months. 6 months of no sleep. And I'm not kidding you. This is no joke. 6 months. And at this point, he was hallucinating. He was seeing monsters all the time. He could barely move. He could barely shower. He could barely, when he was communicating, he was using his body to communicate, because he couldn't communicate with language and speech. And it shows us how important sleep is, how it sort of deprives our brains of basic function if we lose sleep. And this guy just couldn't sleep. 2 years later, the poor chap died from this disease or illness. Now, I won't tell you right now what happened with Michael Cork and why he died, what happened inside his brain and the circuitry, but I'll keep that to the very end of this lecture. How's that? So we'll keep it as a mystery, and then by the end of the lecture, we'll sort of dig deeper and see why this chap couldn't sleep. Is that a good deal? In recorded history, Michael Cork is not the only guy who actually died from lack of sleep. There are other people. There was this soccer superfan who died from watching the European Championship. So he binge watched all the matches for 11 days straight, and he died. And we know rats as well. So if you deprive rats of sleep, so you take away their sleep for 15 days, about 15, 18, they will die too. So we know that. And then one of the stages of sleep called REM sleep. So sleep is fragmented. There's different stages of sleep. One of these stages is called REM sleep. And if I deprive you of REM sleep, okay, about a month of just REM, just this phase of sleep, okay, you will die as well, right? So a month of lack of REM. So this all shows us how important REM sleep is. So we'll get into REM and how what REM is, all this REM, rapid eye movement sleep, the eyes moving back and forth. By the way, so let me go into the stages of sleep right away. So you have that foundation. Zarensky, he was a guy in University of Chicago, 1950s, with his mentor Kleidman, they discovered REM, rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep. Initially, Zarensky saw that these babies, their eyes were moving side to side, okay, like this. I was like, what's going on? And they measured the activity of neurons. You can put, it's called an EEG, you put gel, it's like gel, you put it on the brain, right? You put it on here, and then you measure the waves in the brain, right? So you measure the brain activity. And they did that, and the muscle activity, and they saw that the eyes were moving like this during a certain part of sleep. And the activity of the brain was rapid during one stage of sleep. During this stage, they didn't know what it was at this point. But they could not believe their own eyes when they saw this. I mean, this was a great discovery, the fact that you have sleep, and during one stage of sleep, the brain is hyperactive and the eyes are moving from side to side, and another stage where the brain is quiet. It's all it's slow, the waves slow down, everything is just much more slow. So they found this. In fact, Kleidman, he wanted to test this on his own daughter, Esther. So he brought in Esther, okay, to test, right, is this really true? Can this be right that you have brain activity firing all over the place during one stage and another slow and steady stage? Can this be right? And then they confirmed that with that, his own daughter, okay? Would you do that for science? I would sometimes, okay? They confirmed there are 2 stages of sleep: rapid eye movement sleep and non-REM sleep. So at this point, only 2 overall stages, not several stages, not like REM, deep, stage 1, 2, 3, 4. No, not all that. Just 2 big stages. So this is how it all started in the 1950s, University of Chicago. During stage 1 of sleep, it's where it all started. So it all starts there. You kind of become drowsy. Temperature drops. Heart rate drops. Chemicals in the brain, noradrenaline. You know adrenaline in the body, right? So you have adrenaline when you're sort of hyper and you're active and you are, maybe a car is rushing towards you and you're on the freeway and, have a lot of what? Adrenaline. You have its chemical body in the brain called noradrenaline or norepinephrine, okay? In the brain, that's serve its similar function, making you aroused, making you hyper alert, all right? So you have that. You can imagine when you're reading a book, do you have a lot of noradrenaline or a little bit of noradrenaline?
A little.
A little bit. And then when your mom comes into your room and says, you have to do your homework, okay? Do you have a lot of noradrenaline? A little bit more, right? It rises. And then when you're giving a lecture, more, right? Playing soccer, more. Being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, much, right? There's a lot. Okay, noradrenaline. So it has all this. Now, when you're sleeping, and you're falling asleep during stage 1 of sleep, noradrenaline is slowly falling in activity. So you have less at this point because you have to be less aroused. So your brain has to drop its level of noradrenaline. Serotonin, another neurotransmitter, also drops. Just adding that, but we'll get into that. So you have other neurochemicals in the brain. You all know this. And then blood pressure, temperature. Temperature has to drop for you to sleep. This is one key rule. Temperature has to drop for you to sleep. So temperature, core body temperature drops. So you have that as well. Now, during stage 1, you have all that. The brain is slowly turning off. You have the cortical region, so the brain has different parts. I mentioned that briefly. So you have prefrontal lobes out here. You have the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, like a helmet, right? So you have that, 6 layers deep, just adding that, so 6 layers deep. Okay, you have the visual cortex in the back of your brain, you have all that. When you fall asleep, the cortex quiets down. It slowly quiets down a bit. So you have the cortex becoming more and more quiet. The visual cortex, however, doesn't. So the visual parts of the brain in the back right here is kind of active. So it kind of stays on a bit. Or actually it becomes even, you can say at some point, more active as we enter the dreaming world. The brain is becoming more and more and more quiet. Then you hit deep sleep. Deep sleep. A deep form of sleep. If AJ, right? Okay, good. When I say your name, you have to be quick. AJ, if I wake you up from deep sleep, guess what happens? You'll be like this. Oh, groggy, you can't really focus because it's a very, very, very deep form of sleep. And interestingly, Interestingly, this is very fascinating. Neurons in the brain, the activity of the cortex go like this. Boom, boom, boom. Big ocean wave, synchronized wave. Up and down, up and down. Remember the Kleidman and Sarinsky, the way of measuring brain waves? You can measure that. It's like a symphony, up and down. It's very interesting. It's quite fascinating. I want to contrast that to the wakefulness wave. So when you are awake, the brain has this frenetic, erratic activity like this. Okay? All over the place. But in this deep stage of sleep, so you have this initially, right? These erratic waves, and then everything quiets down, and then suddenly you hit deep sleep, the deep stage of sleep, and it goes like this. Is that clear, Sonia? Okay, good. And by the way, on these big waves of oceans, ocean waves as I call them, you have these spindles, you can't really, it's very hard to explain, but you have to see this on an actual monitor. Have you seen them, Arnold? Like, remember these spindles called sleep spindles. Now, what's going on with the sleep spindles? Is everything clear so far? We said the initial waves are very quick, big waves, and then these spindles, deep sleep. These spindles are telling us that the brain is transferring information from the memory parts of the brain, the hippocampus, seahorse-like structure behind your ears, tucked behind your ears. That's called the hippocampus. It takes information from the memory part of the brain, the hippocampus, and placing that in the cortical region and the outer layer of the brain, which is more like, to use an analogy, perhaps like, the hard drive and the thumb, the memory stick thing, thumb drive. That's kind of like the hippocampus, the memory part of the brain that allows you to store memories. Or, store them initially, have access to them, but then it has to be removed to the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, for long-term storage. Is that clear? So you have to have that, and these spindles help you with that. And you have these spindles during deep sleep. Interesting so far? Does it make sense? So it's important. You know why? Because you want to have a part of your life dedicated to taking information from my daily life and storing that in some kind of a safe vault so it's there, so I have access to that in the future. And that happens during deep sleep. There's deep stage of sleep, okay? And you have some spindles during some of the earlier stages as well, like stages 2 and the stages before deep sleep. But it's mainly during deep. During deep sleep, you have release of growth hormones. You have release of testosterone, although you have that in other stages as well. But it's a key stage for that as well. And this is interesting. I find this utterly fascinating. During deep sleep, glia cells. So you have neurons and you have glia cells, supporting cells, right? These brain cells during deep sleep will shrink by about 20%. Can you believe this? They will shrink, allowing cerebral spinal fluid to bathe the brain. So cerebral spinal fluid is this fluid that will bathe the brain, allowing it to sort of wash all its corridors and all its corners, so you can get rid of toxins and beta amyloid and all these proteins that can build up and become misfolded and lead to dementia and all that. You want to get rid of that, and that happens during deep sleep. So imagine this. How important is deep sleep? Hormones, growth hormones, hair, skin, all that. Memory, taking things from your everyday life, storing that, plus removing all the toxins from your daily life. Pretty important, deep sleep. Okay. But we haven't gotten, still the most important part of sleep is coming. It's called the rapid eye movement sleep. REM sleep. It happens after deep sleep. So stage 1, 2, 3, 4, then we have REM. And during REM, in the back of the brain, in the brain stem, again, I don't want to throw too many terms at you with the brain stem. And you know why? Because when I did the first course, I went back and looked at the comments and they said, this guy, he's using all these Latin terms and you have to be more pedagogical and, so I'm trying to make it more simple. I understand you haven't spent 30 years or 20 years like me studying the brain, so it's right, you have expertise in other areas perhaps. Maybe Arnold, he knows already, but, Brain stem is the lower part of the brain, it's down here, okay? It's very important. Why? Breathing, body temperature, regulating yourself, all that, regulating your core temperature. Mind you, if you have a tiny stroke to the lower part of the brain, the brain stem, guess what happens? Often you will die from that. A tiny stroke there, tiny trauma, you're dead, okay? In contrast, the prefrontal lobes, meaning the part of the brain up here that has to do with decision making and logical thinking and rational thinking and higher functions like poetry, pity, infinity, Shakespeare, all that, you can have massive stroke, you can have you can have a big spear running through that and you will survive. And in fact, you will function in society, you will go around and just be a bit rude and be a little bit frivolous and disinhibited and all that, but you can function. Imagine that the part of the brain that makes us most human, this part of the brain, with all the higher functions, strokes, all that, you will survive and just have a crazy personality, okay? But here, a tiny stroke in that lower part of the brain, and you are probably dead. Now, as we enter rapid eye movement sleep, you have neurons in the brainstem in a structure called the pons, a ball-like structure here, and the medulla oblongata, a long structure here, part of this brainstem lower brain circuit, releasing chemicals glycine and GABA. So you have in the brain neurochemicals that can either be inhibitory or excitatory, okay? Inhibitory or excitatory. The excitatory neurons, dopamine, right? Dopamine, right? You have dopamine. Glutamate is the most famous of them all. GABA is the most abundant inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA. So you have GABA and glycine being spit out by the brainstem, dripping down your neck to the alpha motor neurons, fancy name for dripping down your spinal cord. In your spinal cord, you have connections to entire peripheral system, your entire body, controlling your movement. And so if you have these neurotransmitters kicking in, they will paralyze you during rapid eye movement sleep. And for that reason, you are paralyzed in REM. You're wearing a physiological straitjacket. You can't move during REM. And why can't you move? Why is it important to be paralyzed during rapid eye movement sleep? Why is it so important not to be able to move? Because you have your most lifelike, crisp, vivid, and emotional dreams during REM sleep. So your brain is very clever. It says, look, Heavenly, I can't have you act out your dreams and hurt your sleeping partner or, whatever. You don't want that. So for that reason, I will paralyze you completely from head to toe during rapid eye movement sleep. But then Heavenly here, because she has experience in psychology, worked at, major universities, she will say, well, Baland, you can move your eyes from side to side. What's going on there, right? What's happening there? You're not paralyzed, are you? Is that true? Can it be? And then I'll say, well, look, you have a different circuitry for that. There's a different circuitry in the brainstem going up to the eyes, allowing you to move your eyes. By the way, some people will say, how come you can move your eyes what's the purpose of your eyes moving in REM? It's a good question, right? You want to know, perhaps, right? some will say, or some have said, that these eye movements are in fact the person, the dreaming person, scanning his dreams. Like, here's a dinosaur. Here's my little brother. Here's the moon. So that's perhaps a function. Others have said that it's merely physiology of REM. It's not really anything important. It's more of a byproduct of REM. So it's not really clear why the eyes are moving during rapid eye movement sleep. But here's the kicker. We said the brain waves during wakefulness are what? AJ? You're smart. Heavenly Son is smart here over here, okay? The brain waves are going like this, right? Very active, right? Okay. Very active. Now, if you eavesdrop on the activity of neurons during REM sleep, guess what? They look indistinguishable from the guy who's awake. So if I was to look at a guy who's awake and I look at a guy who's in REM, their brains look the same. The brain suddenly speeds up, everything becomes hyperactive, all the neurons are firing in this erratic pattern. In fact, some parts of the brain are up to 30% more active during rapid eye movement sleep. So there goes the theory that, when you sleep, your brain, your neurons are just, becoming calm and everything is just firing down. No. What you're seeing here is actually your brain being hyperactive, and about 30% more active in certain parts of the brain. Okay. And in the next lecture, we'll get into what parts of the brain, because that's important for understanding dreams. That's very important for understanding dreams. What parts of the brain are active during dreams and what part slows down, okay? Now, you have all that. That's the cycle. That's the stages of sleep. And then, of course, these come, you have all these stages. In one cycle is about 19 minutes, 90 minutes, right? So you have that. But of course, it's not like 90 per se. It can be 100 minutes, 110 minutes, and so you have these boom, boom, boom throughout the night. So if you're sleeping 8 hours like you should, you would have how many of these? Maybe 4 or 5, right? Of blocks of these. Interestingly, during the first half of the night, you have more of deep sleep. During the second half of the night, you have more of REM sleep. So it's almost as if these two stages of sleep are competing, like rivaling sports teams. They're sort of battling out. It's like kind of a wrestling match, and they're competing. The two big hitters, the REM and the deep sleep. And that's important, but I'll get to that, why it's important in a minute. I just want to add something here, which is what's important is REM, you have release of things like growth hormones and testosterone as well, so there's that part of it too. You also have what you could say an interesting function is that REM is all about taking experiences from the day and weaving that into a whole, a narrative-like structure, and extracting wisdom. Does that make sense? So if you think about deep sleep as the boring librarian, just taking information and storing it in different places, REM is the visionary, is the Steve Jobs of sleep, okay? It takes stuff from daily life and sort of creates gist of information and knowledge and wisdom in a way that's almost ineffable. It's like it's this wisdom that we have. Like if you deprive people of REM, they will lack creativity and the spark of wisdom and being able to see the bigger whole in things. Is that clear? So there's that contrast. REM is important for cognitive function, being able to be extremely cognitively acute and fast and having mental agility and all that. That's in REM. Memory, IQ test, all that is a part of the REM REM sleep. It's a REM phenomenon. Now, given our equation was these two stages of battling it out each night, right? If I was to deprive you of, let me actually specify. So more deep sleep, you can have maybe 10 minutes of REM in the first cycle of sleep. 10 minutes of REM, the first cycle. Second, a little bit more. Third, a little bit more. Fifth, the end, the final cycle of sleep, you'll have maybe 1 hour of REM. Does that make sense? Now, if I was to split your sleep in two, split your sleep in two, and I say, Joe, you have to wake up at 7 a.m. or 5 a.m. even, or 3 a.m., giving that let's say you sleep by midnight. I would have deprived you of all the REM sleep of the early morning. Does that make sense? It's not an equal equation, I'm saying. That's the point I'm making here. It's not an equal equation. If I was to cut like 10 inches or like 10% or 20% of the final state, like the final portion of your cycles of sleep, I would have I would have removed a lot of REM sleep. Can you see that? Does that make sense? And then what happens when you have very little REM? What happens then? Which function are lost? Memory, cognition, wisdom, all these things, right? Creativity, all these things goes away. That shows you that biology overall, biology is very messy. It's complex. So you can't just go, oh, I'm just gonna, I'm clever. I'm just gonna, cheat biology and get a few hours here and there. You can't. If you miss a few hours because you have to catch a plane, you would have lost a lot of REM, what I'm saying. Perhaps a rule of thumb, and this is oversimplifying things, but if you're an athlete, you might say, okay, I can get away with, let's say, having my initial hours of sleep. If I have my initial hours of sleep, okay, then at least I'm physically ready to run away from a tiger. And that's the idea, actually. So some people argue that the reason why we have all the physiological benefits coming first is that if you have little sleep, let's say you actually wake up 3 a.m., 4 a.m., something happens, let's say you hear some sounds in the little village you live in. I'm talking about the Stone Age person, right? Okay, so he's living there, and he's awakened, but like at 4 a.m. At least he has the physical ability to run away from tigers and people chasing him and all that. Does that make sense? So arguably, some will say that having all the other creative parts are not that important. It comes later. If you get it, great. You have to have that on a consistent basis. But once in a while, if you only have the physiological aspects as well, well, then you can survive in nature. Does that argument make sense? Kind of? I think so. I think it's a good argument. Importance of sleep. During deep sleep, I have to add this because it's in my notes, so you have lowering of blood pressure during deep sleep, very important aspect. Things like glucose regulation, deep sleep. Things like immune system, deep sleep. In fact, if I deprive you of deep sleep, your sympathetic nervous system, meaning you have your sympathetic nervous system, meaning the nervous system that's active when your heart is boom, 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 pounding and your adrenaline is all over the place. That part of the nervous system is highly active if I don't get a lot of deep sleep. In fact, heart disease and all that can often emerge from not having enough of deep sleep. On the lifespan part of things, sleep will vary a bit. So you notice babies, they sleep a lot. You notice that? Babies, they sleep a lot. And so an infant will spend a lot of time sleeping, 17 hours sometimes sleeping. Like 3 months old baby. Inside the mother's womb, they will sleep all the time, pretty much. And interestingly, the brains of babies are often REM sleep. So they will spend a lot of time in REM, have a lot of REM sleep. So that infant that's sleeping 17 hours, like half of that is pure REM. It's just like REM, REM, REM. Okay. As we age, as we go along to become a bit older, like at years, let's say 4 or 5, you have like 13 hours. Become a teenager, then you have maybe 10 hours. A full-grown adult, you have like, 7 to 8 hours. So sleep varies. But then you might ask, why do you have all that REM? Why do you have all that REM in the baby brain? And how come REM then decreases by the time you reach adolescence and you become a teenager and you become a full-grown adult? Why do you have that change in REM sleep? Well, one idea is that during REM, you have creativity and all that, right? And in fact, you have a lot of synaptic plasticity, meaning that the synapses and the neurons in the brain are starting to become linked up. So there's a lot of neural activity that allows for, and this has to do with a chemical called acetylcholine, but you have a lot of plasticity, meaning a lot of synapses being built in the brain. So the new connections being built, and that's all where all the creativity and knowledge and wisdom is coming about, right? So you have that during REM sleep. And so in a baby brain, does it make sense to have a lot of new synapses and connections and a lot of new information being sort of created? Does that make sense in a baby brain? It does, right? Then you might ask, by adolescence, you have deep sleep emerging and entering the scene and sort of coming in and saying, look, I want my part now. I want to have more time. Why is that important? Well, you can think of deep sleep as also not only the librarian with the books and all that, but also as something that sort of cuts these connections and removes the excess and redundancies, right? So initially you want to have a lot of REM sleep to build the baby brain, and then by the time you reach adolescence, you want to have trimming down called synaptic pruning. You probably already know this, but the brain of a child is hyperconnected. We know this. It's hyperconnected. And then there's genetic processes. There's a gene that's important for pruning, meaning removing excess connections. So it does that through adolescence. It's kind of a use it or lose it situation here. So all the stuff that you're not using in your brain is being cut away. And a part of that happens during deep sleep, and deep sleep being introduced in the final portions and then coming in at adolescence. That does make sense here? Okay, good. But maybe you have an objection. You might ask, how come when you watch a baby, Baland, you said before that babies spend all this time in REM. But you also said that you are paralyzed from head to toe during REM. Didn't you say that, Baland? You did, right? Do babies move when they sleep? You don't have a baby. Do babies move when they sleep? Is this a paradox then? What's going on? The answer is the following. The circuitry responsible for the paralysis has not yet evolved in these babies. It's simply premature. So that's the reason. It's very simple. But they are certainly in REM, and when they are kicking and sometimes smiling even, and that is, some have argued, like Alan Hobson, my colleague over at Harvard Medical School, he argues that these are ways to train your sensory and motor systems. Train them so the child's brain is more able to use them later on. Does that make sense? From a survival perspective, right? The fact that you want to, like a baby doesn't want to, look, biology is so costly. It's deeply costly. Look, this lady was pregnant for 9 months nurturing this baby, right? It's heavy, it's like, and you don't want to lose it. And so the first thing you want to have that baby is to train your sensory motor system so as soon as possible it can move and start to be active, animated and live in the world and survive, essentially, right? Let's go back to the initial question of the guy who died, Michael Cork. This is an important question. How come Michael died? What happened in his brain? He had a rare syndrome called fatal familial insomnia, FFI. It's a genetic disorder. And what happens, Sonia, is that in the brain, there's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Okay? In the hypothalamus, you have a structure beneath it called the thalamus. Thalamus. Hypothalamus is a part of the emotional centers of the brain. The thalamus, on the other hand, thalamus, you know what it is? It's the sensory doorman of the brain. It's like the doorman, the gatekeeper of the brain for sensory filtering and information, right? So everything that comes in through the world, sensing, seeing, hearing, touch, all that, has to pass through the thalamus. It's the doorman. Now, if the thalamus is not working, what happens? Do you become flooded with information and sensory input? You would, right? If the doorman of a, an event is not there, what happens? Flooding, right? Of sensory information. That's exactly what happens. So the thalamus has to shut down for you to sleep, for your sensory parts of your brain, in order to keep vision and touch and hear and all that away from you, you need to have that thalamus, the sensory part of the brain, to be shut down. And so in most of us, in almost all of us, you have that. But Michael Cork, the neurons in his thalamus was dying off. They were being slowly erased. The neurons were dying, so his thalamus, his sensory doorman, was weak. It was, eroding. And so for that reason, he just couldn't, the sensory filter to the world was not there. I mean, he didn't have a filter. And so he was perpetually on. I mean, imagine a car, like the engine always being on, like, or whatever. You having headphones on, it's, all the time, 24 hours. It's some forms of torture, in fact, right? So this is the thalamus, and this is the mystery of Michael Cork and what happened.
Here's my question.
Go ahead, Larry.
I'm 62. You have
All
an amazing memory with names.
You look,
it was very good.
You look 22.
So when I rounded 50, my sleep habits changed rapidly. I thought it was maybe only due to me, but then my wife, who's 9 years younger than me, just hit her early 50s, and she went from being a very deep sleeper. I've always had a very hard time getting to sleep until I approached my early 50s. Yeah. Now I sleep kind of like a baby.
Yeah.
And she has historically slept like a baby. So do people often experience different, is that a predictable physiological reaction to sleep?
Absolutely it is. You know what? It's so important, this portion of how aging affects sleep, that I want to talk about it in the next lecture. I want to dedicate maybe 5-10 minutes to go into depth. This is, I want to answer that. Is that okay, Larry? Yeah. It's a very important question. Sleep definitely changes as we age.
You spoke about REM sleep being important for things like creativity and cognitive flexibility, and how babies have more REM sleep than the general adult population.
Yeah.
Are there any times I could think clinically where somebody wouldn't be getting the REM sleep and we're prioritizing things like deep sleep for physiological functioning with things like trauma and things like that? Do you ever see cases where that's seems to be happening?
So the brain sleep is favoring deep sleep in trauma?
Just in any case clinically where you would have a situation where somebody would be favoring that deep sleep over the more creative REM sleep.
Have you watched my lectures online or this guy? It's gonna be, even that point, I'm gonna keep it maybe 10 minutes in the lectures. But there is actually a condition. It's called depression. And I'll cover that in depth. Now, in case I forget, I need you to give me some kind of signal or something in the lecture. I want to talk about this, about deep sleep and depression. It's very important. Thank you, AJ.